Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. You should see some audio instructions on your screen, so you should be automatically connected to audio, and there's no need to call in if you are. However, if you're experiencing difficulties, that should become evident fairly quickly, so we do have a call-in number for you as a backup, and that's on the screen. With that, we'll get started. So this presentation is going to offer a framework for mentoring CASB students throughout the Spring 2013 session. And in that session, we're offering modules 1, 2, 3, and 5. My name's Laura Gregorick, and I'm CASB's Director of CA Training Office Engagement. And I'll be leading you through the material today. Later on in the session, we'll also have Cami Lotti, who's our Manager of Online Facilitation, and she'll join us to answer your questions at the end of the session. So we have a full hour together today, but we only have about 45 minutes of formal material to cover. So we have plenty of time to address your questions, and if you don't have a lot of them, we will finish a little bit early. You can submit your questions throughout the session, and you can do that by using the Q&A menu in Live Meeting, and you'll find that on the top of your screen. As I just mentioned to you, Cami will be joining us at the end of the session, and that's when we'll address your questions. You can also download a copy of today's presentation, and that's available by clicking the Handouts icon, and that's in the top right-hand section of your screen. It's the icon that looks like 3 little sheets of paper. So by the end of today's session, you'll be familiar with some key features of the CASB program. You'll also be able to identify some student challenges that are common to all the modules. You'll be aware of common mentoring practices, and those would be both at smaller and larger training offices. You'll understand what you can do as mentors to support your students. You'll also know what resources are available to assist you, and you'll know how to access the CASB Mentor Center and how to register for the mentor modules. So since we have some mentors who are new and unfamiliar to with the CASB program, we'll start with just a very brief overview of the CASB program. So facilitated competency-based learning is pretty much the foundation of the program, and each of CASB's 5 initial modules do include a number of components. We have the weekly narratives that offer students an opportunity to role play through real-world simulations, and students would complete some weekly tasks as they progress through each module, and a number of resources are available to students to assist them when they're completing those tasks. And we have things like the Technical Resource Center and the Virtual Professional Library to help them do that. Students would also attend some weekly online chats, and those are led by a facilitator for some additional guidance. And the chat transcripts are posted on the discussion board for the benefit of those students who were not able to attend. Once students have submitted their tasks, they also receive facilitator feedback, and they make revisions as necessary to achieve competency on those tasks. And students also can complete some weekly multiple choice questions, or MCQs, and they're a really good self-study tool because they enable students to review some of the technical information that they've covered and to receive instant feedback on how they're doing. For each module, students also attend a 3-day face-to-face interactive session. And at this session, they would review some specific competencies and the pervasive qualities and skills, and they'd also focus on case writing. And then each module ends with an evaluation, and this would include some combination of a comprehensive case, multi-subject questions of varying lengths, or some multiple choice questions. So then each module is 8 weeks long, and so during weeks 1 through 7, students would read the weekly narratives and then complete their weekly tasks. They'd be receiving feedback from their facilitators, and then they'd revise their responses to the tasks based on that feedback. And then during this period, students also have the option of attending the weekly online chats and completing the self-study multiple choice questions. And then tasks end in week 7 of the module, so that leaves students with plenty of time to prepare for the module end evaluation, and that takes place on the Friday of week 9. And then each module also has that 3-day face-to-face session, and that takes place on a Friday through Sunday at some point through the first 7 weeks of the module. So to assist you in mentoring your students, we do have a mentor center on the CASB website, and it contains some administrative, general mentoring, and some module-specific mentoring resources, and it's openly available to anyone who's interested. And we also provide registered mentors with access to all the CASB learning materials, and we do that through our mentor modules. So these would be the same learning materials that students are accessing as they make their way through the modules. And we'll talk about how you can register for these resources later in our session. So next, we'll identify some student challenges that are common to all the modules. And we do have some resources that also help with module-specific challenges, and you can find those in the Mentor Center. So before we talk about student struggles, we should probably take a moment to understand the level of progression that's built into the CASB modules. So as students are progressing from modules 1 to 5, the CASB curriculum does include some more integrative content. And what that means is that students do need to consider kind of all of the implications of the issues, the interrelationship of the issues, and use multiple resources to develop a solution. Students are also faced with some more complex tasks with less direction. So solutions do require some technical knowledge and professional judgment as well. And then each module would place higher expectations on students' communication and critical thinking skills. So the responses do have to be tailored to the specific audience, and students would have to thoroughly research them, analyze, and support their recommendations and ensure that their recommendations are useful to the users. And then as students develop competencies in each of the modules, our expectations of them are progressively increasing. So that's why we tend to see some common areas of weakness across all the modules. It's not that students aren't developing along the way, it's simply that we expect more of them as they are progressing. So then the 5 most common areas where we typically see students struggling across all 5 of the CASB modules would include communication and critical thinking skills, case writing skills, research skills, technical skills, and the ability to manage their time. So when it comes to communication skills, we often see students struggling with proper formatting. So students might not use headings and bullet points effectively, or they often do not format their spreadsheets appropriately. Another common issue that we see is the use of an overly critical tone, especially when they're reviewing the work of others. So sometimes this can come off as maybe arrogance rather than confidence. Sometimes students do fail to consider users' sophistication level, and they might use some language or maybe provide a level of detail that is inappropriate for their audience. And then when it comes to critical thinking skills, we see 2 types of issues usually. So the first would be bias. So students might come to a conclusion a little prematurely. And so even though their conclusion is generally supported by the evidence, their response might not be thorough enough, and they might omit some important contradictory information or other alternatives. And so it's kind of like ignoring the inconvenient facts, and that is what would lead to bias. And then on the flip side of that, students might also provide a thorough and maybe excessively long analysis, but then they'd fail to prioritize the most important issues. And then as a result, they also fail to provide recommendations to users. So there really isn't a conclusion. So students also commonly struggle with case writing across all 5 modules, and the challenges that we see in this area often relate to issue identification. So here, students might miss some of the important issues that are critical to the case. Also depth, so some students might identify a critical issue, but they might only discuss it quite superficially, so as a result their response might lack some depth. Also case facts, so some students might provide some generic excerpts from technical resources in their responses rather than really integrating the specific case facts from the case that they're considering. And then we have users' needs. So some students might not consider users' needs, and they might provide some information that is actually irrelevant to the specific users in a given case. And then when it comes to qualitative, some students might neglect to explain their calculations. So every quantitative analysis has to have a corresponding qualitative component. And then finally, some students might provide a thorough analysis, but then they don't provide a conclusion. And again, every case must also include recommendations that would address those users' needs. So some of those challenges that we just looked at, they might look a bit similar to the ones that we identified on the previous slide, and that's because communication and critical thinking skills are related to case writing. And so students whose skills are well developed in these areas would be a little more proficient at case writing as well. So CASB does encourage students to be self-directed learners. We don't tell students where to find information, so we do expect them to research it themselves, and some students might not do well with this lack of direction as well. Students will likely encounter some technical challenges as they're making their way through the CASB program, and it really is difficult for us to generalize the technical areas that students would struggle with. We do cover a wide variety of technical topics across the 5 modules, and students can struggle basically with any of these areas. So the best way for you to identify where your students are struggling is simply to have a discussion with them. And then finally, throughout the CASB program, students do struggle with being able to manage their time wisely. And the CASB program is challenging, and we completely understand that students' professional workloads can also be substantial. So students do find occasionally that managing the CASB program demands with their workplace demands is a little bit overwhelming. And then achieving competency likely does require revision. So some students do not clear their revisions promptly, or sometimes they underestimate the amount of time it takes to clear revisions, and this also results in a time crunch. And then some students might employ a cram mentality when it comes to preparing for the module and evaluations. And what we'd like to stress here, it's really that every task that they've completed throughout the prior 8 weeks has been steadily preparing them for the evaluation. So there really is no need to cram at the last minute. So now that we've provided an overview of some of the common mentoring practices, now we'll provide an overview of the common mentoring practices and differentiate between those that would work best in more of a smaller office environment and then those that would be more appropriate for some of the larger office environments. So offices with fewer students and fewer staff members to support those students may not have enough resources to implement overly complex mentoring programs. And so many smaller offices typically select 2 or 3 basic mentoring activities that they'd be focusing on. And most commonly what we see is a buddy system, and so this would provide students with some focused one-on-one support, practice case writing sessions, and this would provide students with some additional opportunities to practice their case writing skills, and they'd also be receiving some directed feedback on the cases they've written. And then time off for study. And this is not a CASB mandated practice, but we are aware that offices do offer some time off for study. And then in addition to these practices, the larger offices would have more students and more staff available to support them. And so they sometimes choose to carry out other mentoring practices. And what we've commonly seen is an orientation session, and so this provides students with an overview of the CASB program, and it outlines kind of what students can expect over the next couple of years. We've also seen Module 1 sessions, and these sessions would provide some support and guidance in areas where students are typically struggling, especially when they're new to the CASB program. A case writing skills session, and this offers additional support to students when they're writing comprehensive cases and integrated multi-subject questions for the first time. And then technical sessions, and so these would provide some additional instruction in some technical areas that some students might find challenging. At the larger offices, we've also seen module champions, and these are basically go-to people for module-specific questions. And we've also seen administrative support for the office's CASB mentoring program. And then a formalized CASB mentoring team that provides overall leadership for the office's CASB mentoring activities. So we do have a CA Training Office Mentoring Practices presentation that's in the Mentor Center, and you can watch that for some additional information about these common mentoring practices. And I do want to stress that none of these practices are required. We're just simply highlighting some of the ones that we're aware of that some training offices employ. So we do encourage you to select those that would work best in your environment. So next we'll suggest a general framework that you can use to support your CASB students during the first 5 modules. And this framework is applicable to Module 4 as well, but since Module 4 is not offered in the spring session, we don't mention it specifically in today's session. And for some module-specific mentoring tips, you can also refer to the Modules 1 through 5 mentoring tips presentation, and that's in the Mentor Center. So in the previous section, we did cover some common mentoring practices at training offices. So in this section, we're going to concentrate on those that would work best in all offices, regardless of size. The tasks end in week 7 of all modules, and we don't assign any additional tasks to students in week 8. So what that means is students can use that time to prepare for the module end evaluations, which take place in week 9. So since students should have sufficient time to prepare for module end evaluations, and time off for study is not CASB mandated, we won't focus on that particular practice during today's session. So we'll take a look at the timeline again. So each module is 8 weeks long, and the evaluation takes place in week 9, and then results are released subsequently. And students do have a brief period of time after that point to appeal their results. So the Module 1 face-to-face session takes place earlier in the 8-week module. And then the face-to-face sessions for Modules 3 and 5 take place around the middle of the modules. And then the Module 2 face-to-face session takes place toward the end of the module. And if you're looking for specific dates, you can refer to our schedule of key dates that's in the Mentor Center. So from a mentoring perspective, we'll focus on the buddy system and practice case writing sessions. And as buddies, we would recommend that mentors would check in with their students 3 times in each module. So the first time would be once at the beginning of the module, and that would set the stage for the relationship and identify any potential concerns that the student might have. And then we recommend checking in once at around the midpoint of the module to see how things are going and to discuss potentially communication and critical thinking feedback that the students have received. And then once at the end of week 7. And this would be to discuss the plan for preparing for the module end evaluation. Then in week 8, you'll want to encourage your students to write some practice cases. And in larger offices, this can be done in more formal group-type sessions. And in smaller offices, students can write the practice cases on their own, and mentors can provide the feedback individually. And then finally, if your office has the resources to implement any of the additional mentoring practices that we discussed earlier, so for example, maybe the technical sessions or the sessions targeted at developing some specific skills, these practices can take place at any point throughout the modules. So that's the overall framework. Next, we'll cover what happens at each of the check-ins and how you can address some of the common student challenges that we see. So at the first check-in, you'll want to set the stage for the mentoring relationship between you and your students. And this would include determining how you're going to work together and what your respective responsibilities will be. You'll also want to ensure that your students do become familiar with the module content and that they anticipate any challenges that they might encounter. So you can review the student overview together and also the practical application checklist for the module. And since time management is also an area that we see students struggling with, you might also want to refer your students to some work-life balance resources or other tools that would help them manage their time effectively and basically avoid feeling overwhelmed. And then after reviewing the student overview together, you may want to ask your students what challenges they anticipate encountering, how they're going to address these challenges, and how you can assist. And then similarly, after reviewing the practical application checklist, you might also want to consider how you can reinforce your students' learning in the workplace. And then finally, you might want to have a discussion about effective time management. So the student overviews for all the modules will be useful during that first check-in, and they contain the module storyboards, and those outline the tasks that are going to be performed by students on a week-to-week basis. They also outline the roles that the students going to be taking on during each of the modules, and they highlight some of the resources that students will find useful when they're completing their tasks. So you can find these overviews in the Mentor Center. And then we have the practical application checklists, and they're also going to be useful during the first check-in. And they basically provide an alternate view of what students do in each module. So they group the tasks by competency area, so you can see the variety of tasks that students are capable of performing in the various areas after completing each module. And so what this does, basically this tool would allow you to determine which tasks students might be capable of performing in the workplace as well. So you can find those practical application checklists in the Mentor Center. And then when it comes to time management, the work-life balance section of the CICA's website does have a number of resources and tools that might help students when it comes to maintaining balance and avoiding becoming overwhelmed. And your office might also have some internal resources or employee assistance programs that could also be useful if students are really struggling. And then the other point that we'd like to make, really, is that you can encourage your students to reach out to other students in their network. I mean, they're all going through the same thing, and it's likely very nice to have that support network, and some of them may have already found some effective survival strategies that they can share with each other. So at the second check-in, you'll want to understand how things are going so far. And this is simply because the student is now at the midpoint of the module. And you might also want to encourage the development of communication and critical thinking skills because students do receive some numerical ratings and some written feedback on these skills at certain points in each module. So together with your students, you can review their communication and critical thinking ratings and feedback. And you can also review the communication and critical thinking guide just to get a better understanding of what the ratings and feedback mean and how students can improve. You might also want to review the Critical Thinking Mentor tool, and that offers some specific guidance on how to assist your students in this area. And you can also offer to review facilitator feedback on some of the weekly tasks with students if they feel that's necessary. The guiding questions that you might want to ask your students at this point would include, how are things going? You know, do you have any concerns? How do you feel about the ratings and feedback you've received on your communication and critical thinking skills? And what are your thoughts on other feedback received from your facilitator so far? So we do suggest that you and your students familiarize yourselves with the Communication and Critical Thinking Guide. It does provide some substantial guidance on how students can improve these skills, and you can find that guide in the Mentor Center. So to improve their formatting skills, which is something we identified that students struggle with earlier, students can use a formatting checklist, and we provide one in the Communication and Critical Thinking Guide in Appendix C. And then the various CASB guides also provide examples of how to format quantitative analyses. So you can refer your students to the examples in these guides. We've included a few examples of guides available to students on this slide, but you can find all of these guides in the Technical Resource Center in each CASB Mentor module. And then to ensure that they're using appropriate tone, you can refer your students to Appendix D of the Communication and Critical Thinking Guide. And that appendix contains a checklist and some further guidance on professional tone. And then to ensure that students are considering user sophistication level and that they're using language or providing a level of detail that's appropriate for their audience, you can refer them to Appendix E of the Communication and Critical Thinking Guide. That appendix contains a checklist and some further guidance on audience. And then we have two tools that are available to assist your students with their critical thinking skills. So we have Appendix F of the Communication and Critical Thinking Guide, and it contains a checklist and some further guidance on critical thinking. And we also have a mentor tool that offers some further suggestions on how you can coach your students in order to strengthen their critical thinking skills. And you can find both the Communication and Critical Thinking Guide and the Critical Thinking Mentor tool in the Mentor Center. So the third check-in would take place once the tasks have ended in week 7. And at this check-in, you'll want to identify how students are going to prepare for the module end evaluation and also what they're going to need from you in order to do so. So at this point, you can encourage your students to develop a plan of attack, and together you can lay out what you're going to do to support them. So student activities will inevitably include some form of technical review, and you can refer to the materials that we've pointed out earlier in the session for guidance on that. And then student activities are also going to include writing practice cases, and we'll talk more about that shortly. So the guiding questions for this final check-in would include, how will you prepare for the module end evaluation, and how can I be of assistance? So checking in with your students to see how the face-to-face session went and to identify any technical challenges is also a good idea. And then since the face-to-face sessions take place at different times for different modules, you can have this discussion with your students at any of the 3 recommended check-in points that we've already highlighted. So it doesn't warrant a separate check-in. So if you do want to discuss how the face-to-face session went, you can review the face-to-face material and the list of useful resources and readings in the student overview together, and also some of the information in the Technical Resource Center. Your office might also have some internal resources that you can use to assist in coaching your students through some of the technical weaknesses that they might be experiencing. And that could be things like technical guides or subject matter experts internal to your office. And then we do encourage, you can encourage your students to complete the weekly multiple choice questions as well, because those are really good for technical review, and encourage them to participate in the weekly chats. And then at this point, you might also want to ask your students how the face-to-face session went, and then ask them to identify any technical or research challenges that they've encountered so far, so that together you can figure out how best to support them through these types of challenges. So each module does have a week-by-week list of useful resources and readings. So students can use this list for reference when they're performing research to complete their weekly tasks. And the resources will also help them overcome some of their technical challenges. So these lists are available in the module student overview documents, and that's in the Mentor Center. So additionally, when you're coaching your students through their technical weaknesses and encouraging the development of research skills, you can refer to any of the resources in the Technical Resource Center, and that's located in the CASB Mentor modules. The Technical Resource Center contains a number of CASB guides, so specific technical guides arranged by competency area. There's some online tutorials for certain subject areas, and there's also links to some relevant external information. Each week of the module also contains some optional multiple choice questions that students can complete, and the MCQs are a really good technical review tool because students are going to receive instant feedback on how they're performing as they complete each question. So you can find the weekly MCQs in the CASB Mentor modules. So finally, if your students are struggling with identifying resources or working through the technical topics, you can also encourage them to attend the weekly chat sessions. So in these sessions, the facilitators would identify some good technical resources and provide some general tips on how to approach weekly tasks. And so these sessions are not mandatory, but what we found is that students who are attending the chat sessions perform better in their tasks. And so next, we'll discuss practice case writing sessions. The purpose of these sessions would be to provide students with some additional opportunities to practice their case writing skills and also to provide them with some feedback on the cases that they have written. At larger offices, students would write a practice case in exam-like conditions, probably in a group setting, while at smaller offices it would happen individually. And a mentor would then evaluate the response and provide feedback. Larger offices might hire someone to perform this function. We have seen that. And then cases are also debriefed in a group setting in some of the larger offices and individually in smaller offices. And the feedback received would then dictate the direction of self-study that students would be doing in week 8 of the module. So you want to evaluate and provide feedback on a practice case as soon as tasks end in week 7. And this basically allows additional time for students to write more practice cases on their own throughout week 8. We have a number of resources that are available to assist you and your students with the practice case writing process, and then we'll cover these in the following slides. So to assist your students, you can refer to the Approaching a Simulation Guide, and this guide is available in the CASB Mentor modules. And we also have a presentation that's Approaching a Simulation that you can find in the Mentor Center, and this offers some specific guidance on case writing. You might also want to refer to that one. And in the last few pages of the Approaching a Simulation Guide, we provide students with an example of how to outline a simulation. So again, you can find this guide in the CASB Mentor modules. And the practice case introduction would provide students with some further guidance on how to approach and debrief simulations. You can find this document in the CASB Mentor modules. Debriefing is an important part of the learning process. So some mentor modules contain a debriefing guide that students and mentors may find useful. So each module also contains a number of case studies, which include a case assessment and a sample response. And then you and your students would use these resources when you're writing, evaluating, and debriefing practice cases. And you can find these in the CASB Mentor modules. So students use laptops to input their responses to module evaluations and also for the UFI. So they are required to use software called Secure Exam, which is a special kind of lockdown type software program. And it would disable most of the computer's functionality and file access while the students are writing evaluations. So you can encourage your students to use Secure Exam when they're writing their practice cases, just so that they become familiar with the software and they're less likely to experience issues on evaluation day. So we have the Secure Exam guides, and they're available in the Mentor Center if you're looking for additional guidance. We also have another guide that offers Secure Exam tips for case writing, and you'll find that guide in the CASB Mentor modules. Okay, so although any size office may choose to implement the remaining practices, larger offices will likely be able to implement them more readily because they do require some greater effort and resources. So these practices can be held at any point through the modules, although the orientation session, the Module 1 session, and the case writing skills session are likely going to be most effective near the beginning of Module 1. The case writing skills session can also be held as a refresher at any point during the CASB program, particularly in Module 5. And that's simply because in that module, having an effective case writing approach is critical. And then as a reminder, you can watch the CA Training Office Mentoring Practices presentation, and that's in the Mentor Center, for some additional information about any of those common mentoring practices. So today's session offered a general mentoring framework that you can apply across all the modules to assist students with challenges that we commonly see across all the modules. For some module-specific mentoring tips and resources, you can refer to the appropriate section in the Mentor Center because we do have specific tips for each module, including UFI Prep. So next, we'll identify the resources that are available to assist you when you're supporting your students, and we'll also point out how you can access the CASB Mentor Center. So you have three sources of information available to you. We have the Mentor Center, the CASB Mentor modules, and the UFI Prep Mentor module. So we'll just take a moment to distinguish these from each other. So the CASB Mentor Center contains a number of different mentoring resources, and so this would be an overview of some common CASB mentoring practices at training offices. There's a general framework for mentoring students through Modules 1 to 5, which is today's presentation. We have some module-specific mentoring tips, and then there's some additional mentoring guidance on some more specific topics, such as case writing and critical thinking. And then any recordings of webinars that we hold related to mentoring are also posted to the Mentor Center. And it's located on the CASB website, and it's open to all, so you don't have to register to get access to that. So then we have the two different types of mentor modules. The CASB mentor modules contain all of the learning materials from modules 1 through 5. So this would basically be providing mentors with access to the same materials that students are engaging with while they're making their way through the CASB modules. And they contain links to some of the relevant Mentor Center resources as well. So the CASB mentor modules are housed in Desire to Learn, which is CASB's learning management system. And because of that, you do have to register to gain access to those modules. And then finally, we have the UFI Prep mentor module, and that would contain all the learning materials from CASB's UFI Prep program. And it also links out to some of the relevant resources in the Mentor Center. And it would provide you with access to all of the materials that students get access to while they're preparing for the UFI. And again, this module is contained in Desire to Learn, and so you do have to register to get access. And so all of the resources that we discussed today are contained in either the Mentor Center or the CASB mentor modules. And so finally, we'll end with showing you how to register for the mentor modules. So as we just mentioned, the CASB mentor modules are going to contain all the learning materials from modules 1 through 5. And you do have to register to get access to it. So in order to register, you do have to be either a qualified CA or a CASB student who would be more senior to the student that you're mentoring. And we do allow HR and student contacts at training offices to register to get access, and they don't have to be CAs. So to register, all you have to do is complete the CASB mentor registration application, and that's in the forms section of our CASB website. And we refresh our mentor list in about early September each year, just to make sure that that list is up to date and you're continuing to get access to materials that you want to get access to. So it's good for a year, and we'll refresh it each fall. So we didn't specifically discuss UFI Prep today, but we also have a similar module for UFI Prep as well. Again, you have to register, so you do have to be a qualified CA to register, or a CASB student who successfully completed the UFI. And again, we do allow access to HR or student contacts of training offices, even if they're not CAs. And to register for this module, there's a separate form. It's the UFI Mentor Registration Application, and that's on our CASB website. And so for this site, registration is also valid for 1 year, but we refresh the registration list in April because that's when the new UFI prep content usually becomes available. So that concludes the formal part of the presentation. As I mentioned at the beginning of today's session, you can download a copy of the slides by clicking on the handouts icon, and that's in the top right-hand section of your screen. Again, it's the icon that looks like 3 little sheets of paper. So at this point, we'll take your questions. And as a reminder, you can submit your questions using the Q&A function in live meeting. I will read the questions out loud, and we'll have Cami, who's CASB's Manager of Online Facilitation, respond to them. So I'm just going to pause for a moment and see, Cami, are you on the line?
I'm here.
Great. Welcome.
Thank you.
Okay. So the first question that we have is, how many practice cases are available in each module? So we'll hand it over to you, Cami.
Thank you, Laura. It varies a little bit between the modules just because the evaluations are a little bit different for each module. So for each of the modules, there are different numbers of cases. And it's about 6 to 12 for each module. And the reason that the numbers vary just slightly is that in Module 1 and 4, the evaluation is one larger comprehensive case, whereas in Modules 2, 3, and 5, there's 2 to 3 short multi-subject cases available.
Perfect. Thank you, Cami.
No problem.
We have another question, and that is, what type of feedback should mentors be giving students when reviewing their case responses?
Yes, good question. The best thing to do is to start with the evaluation guide and go through and assess the student based on each of the competencies that are included in the evaluation guide, giving them the ranking that they would have achieved given their response, and then to give them some feedback on how they can improve that to get to the next level of ranking. And the feedback should be detailed in that, you know, is it a technical knowledge issue? Was it a breadth issue where they didn't actually identify the issue? Or is it a depth issue where they identified the issue but they didn't analyze it in enough detail? And then, of course, as Lara mentioned, one of the common things that students struggle with is just their writing style in general, and so that may be one of the problems as well. So, you know, you want to look at, are they being too concise? Are they being concise enough? Are they going off on tangents? Are their quantitative analysis laid out in a way that's easy to follow? And then just give them a few tips to improve each of those pieces.
Excellent. Thanks, Cami. So I'm not seeing any additional questions. So if you do think of anything that comes to mind subsequent to the session, you do have my email address, and feel free to send that directly to me, and I'll definitely make sure that you get a response. So thank
Lara,
you very much. Oh, yes?
Sorry to interrupt you. I see a question here, actually.
Oh, okay, you do. Oh, there you go. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
No problem. But I just stopped you before you called it quits.
Oh, my goodness. Sorry about that. Okay, so how long does CASB need to process our, applications? Okay, so that would be for the mentor applications. And generally, the holdup there, so when you do apply, we have to do a confirmation process of either that you are a qualified CA or an official HR or student contact, or have successfully completed the UFI if you're still a student wanting to UFI mentor. So basically, that does take about a week or so just to get proper confirmation. Normally, it's the member in good standing piece of it that takes about 5 business days. So if you're experiencing delays in that, just let me know, and I'll be happy to look into why it's taking so long. Okay, and with that, I officially do not see any more questions. So again, if you do think of something after the fact, feel free to email me directly, and we'll make sure that you get a response. Thank you very much for participating in the session. A recording of the session will be posted on the Mentor Center in about a week or so. So that concludes today's session. Thank you.